Dear guests, dear colleagues, so I have the difficult task to follow this very extensive and interesting presentation of the beginning of geodesy, at least in the last centuries. But as you may understand, and maybe as a bias as General Secretary, I have concentrated myself of the history during that time of the Association of Geodesy itself, and certainly not pretend to make the history of the geodesy itself during that period, which would be much longer and which would require also a lot of work I have not yet done on this era. So as you may see, the initial idea was really that to use in particular the document of the Paris Central Bureau, and I was helped by the Pascal Willis, who was, when I was General Secretary, the Assistant Secretary. So you may certainly have various views when you want to present such a thing, the chronology, the organization aspect within IUGG, the various activity of IUGG, the links of IUGG with other organizations, what the role of the people, and also the service type of activity. And I have done a choice to make a more reasonable and not too long presentation, by in fact starting by a chronological overview of the period, which gives the main component, and then to come back to shortly summary the main meetings of IUGG during that time, the officers of IUGG, the development of the international service, which we just heard the beginning of 1 or 2, but which developed during that time, and I shall just do a few remarks at the end. So, and this is just, I guess, a smooth connection with the presentation by Professor Torger. I start in 1917, sorry. It were in the middle of the First World War, but as you mentioned, it was also this year, the death of the General Basso, who was the last president of the previous IUGG. I shall say IUGG to just the consistent community, because there will be change of name. And it was also the term, it was said already, of the director of the Central Bureau, Elbert. And again, it was at that time this initiative to try to continue the IUGG work by this reduced organization, so two neutral countries, as it was described, with Raoul Gauthier from Switzerland as president. The first important event in this period is 1919, which is the creation of the International Union of Geodesy of Geophysics. It was just after the end of the First World War, and in July of 1919 was established in Belgium an assembly which was called Constituting Assembly of the future International Council of Scientific Union, which was called at that time International Research Council. And in this council, the members of this council were countries, but also international unions. So in the same time, several international unions were established, among them the IUGG. And during also the same organization, the IUGG becomes protection of geodesy of this IUGG. IUGG being at that time divided in several sections on geodesy, seismology, meteorology, and so on. And during that, an initial bureau was created with this scheme of bureau we still see now, which is the president, vice president, and the general secretary. And the president was William Bowie. The vice president, which was selected in 1919, was Vincenzo Reina, who unfortunately died later that year. And the general secretary, Georges Perrier, who is the son of François Perrier, you have seen in the present presentation. This is a picture of William Bowie and one of Georges Perrier. In 1922, was the real first, in this new system, General Assembly of IUGG. So the mechanism was selected already, as we continue to see, that there was a General Assembly of IUGG, and the association, or at that time section, had at the same time, or just before, their own General Assemblies, and also meeting like executive committee. So this was the case of this meeting in 1922, where also the IUGG got its General Assembly, and a new executive committee of IUGG was established. I don't want to go too much in details, but but in the written document I shall do, I shall put in particular the way the executive committee were organized, just for those who want to see the detailed evolution of the international organization. Another point which is interesting that year, that after the death of the previous vice president, Raoul Gauthier, who was the president of the interim IUGG organization, was elected as vice president, which was also helpful because to have a smooth link, because there was still some activity done during this the first war year with by this neutral country, which had to be absorbed and reabsorbed by the new IUGG organization. One of the points which was new also in the organization is that it was decided to have people who would make an overview of all the activity in a given field and make a report at each General Assembly. So there was decided a list of reports with reporters, which was also designed or selected during the assembly. And of course, this gives you an overview of the various problem and domain of activity which were defined at that time. And you see shortly, you had a report on basis and triangulation, one on precise leveling, one on geodetic astronomy, one on deflection of vertical, gravity, isostasy, variation of latitude, map projection, Earth styles, solid Earth styles, which were, and stability of the Earth as a timekeeper, so the problem of rotation of the Earth and Earth, which was later abandoned because it was estimated as too astronomical, and so there was no enough implication, at least at that time, of the geodesics on that, and so it was cancelled. I just show you the copy of the volume 2 of the Travaux of the section of geodesy. I shall just come back of the publication of IUGG, which was those from the Rome meeting. The next assembly in 24 was in Madrid, also IUGG and IUGG. And a lot of things appear in its assembly in 1924. First, the first statutes of the section of geodesy, which were prepared by the General Secretary Georges Perdier, were presented, discussed both by the Executive Committee and presented to the members' country, what we would call now council, and which at that time, again, I didn't want to go to details, was called the Permanent Committee. The Permanent Committee was the collection of the national representatives, which were in fact more or less delegates to the General Assembly. So these were the first organization was then adopted and published. Again, it was already mentioned by Professor Torge. In that year, after a very lengthy discussion, IUGG adopted and may ask to IUGG to endorse this adoption, this resolution, the so-called, which were called an international ellipsoid, which was the so-called A4 99 ellipsoid, which was the first international ellipsoid adopted by IUGG. Also, I was mentioning, it was proposed by the Secretariat of IUGG, which is the Central Bureau and the General Secretary, the publication system, which was the beginning of what we can see now, and in particular, the idea of having a bulletin called Bulletin Géodésique was adopted, and so it was decided to have this bulletin in the way which go up to now with various change of name and details, but the initial decision was at that time, and in parallel, this idea of travaux, which was also adopted. Travaux were composed by two parts. It was all the publication of the national report of activity, which was submitted by each country to the General Assembly, and the general reports, which was basically the collection of the report I was mentioning, the so-called reports on all the field by the permanent reporter. So this was basically the point. It was also said that what called the Central Bureau, which was headed by the General Secretary and established in Paris, would start to have a library, and in particular to collect by exchange publication of various countries, in particular by exchange between the IUGG publication and other journals. And so there was a start of this library, which was still existed up to the end of the Central Bureau, and which is still archived now in France. And then also in the details, there was the creation of the so-called International Geodetic Bibliography, which I guess was stopped more or less this year, or was started also at that Madrid meeting. This is just a show the cover of the first number of the Bulletin Géodésique from 1925. Again, for specialists, there has been two previous issues, which are test issues of the Bulletin Géodésique, so you could find maybe a number 1 alone and a number 2 alone, but restarted. And at the beginning, the bulletin was published by 4 copies in one cover, so it's 1 to 5, and this started in this way. Another point which was created in Madrid was the creation of commissions. And this is also, so in addition to the report, they created commissions. Commission was, the main role of commission was really to meet during the general and to discuss during the General Assembly. So each commission has sometimes 3, 4, 5 meetings because at that time you had exchange by letters and so on, but to some extent the General Assembly were a place to really make progress in the discussion and in the decision. So this was created, and from one is special on finance, which was dealing with the finance of IUGG, and then you see, I don't want to mention them, you had one on INVAR, so concerning this question of unit of length of base, so you had a lot of continuity was presented before. You had on gravity, latitude, and projection, so some of them are just really the same topic as reports, but you had the commission, for instance, to have common topics of research between seismology and volcanology. So at that time, there was a commission to see how you have common activity between seismology and volcanology, which were at that time other section of IUGG, and and a lot of discussion about junction of triangulation. So which were between either junction or problem of extension of arcs, for example. So you had you can read yourself another one. But which was really showing that one of the big issues in the development of geodesy at that time was the expansion of triangulation and their junction in order to be little by little able to make a more global adjustment. In 1930, this is the next date I selected, concerning the Stockholm General Assembly. The point was that at that time it was decided, and it was a proposal, by the way, a proposition of a section of geodesy to IUGG, that to change the term of section by the term of association. So this was approved during that meeting. So, and this is where the Association of Geodesy as a designation really started, and in the meantime, the other section in seismology and so on also became called association. In the meeting in Lisbon, one of the points, so I shall go into, was the election of a new president. Up to now, that was Bowie was still president for the same, by Vending Minets, which was elected president at that General Assembly in Lisbon. Another point I wanted to just to mention also is the assembly of in 1939 in Washington, just for 2 general. It was the first assembly outside Europe, because all the assembly from the beginning has been within Europe. Also, you have heard that some country from US and so on took part, and so on. The first time the General Assembly was hosted outside Europe was for Washington. It was also the time it was the last assembly, before the Second World War, and which means that already there has been some people who didn't attend, who left it, and so on. Okay.
It was in September. September, when the Germans were stupid enough, my country, to start the 1st of September. So the war started a week before its assembly took place.
Yeah. But I jumped directly to the next meeting, to the first meeting after the end of the Second War, which was held in 1946 in Cambridge, UK. In fact, there is two meetings. The first was they established what was called an extraordinary meeting in December of 1945, and an executive committee meeting of IUGG in Oxford in July 46. And so this is during this meeting, there has been change for IUGG in the officer. So a new IUGG president was designated by Walter Lambert, and for the secretary, the previous General Secretary, Georges Perrier, died in 1946, so he was replaced by Pierre Tardy, who was Assistant Secretary, and at that time. I have just shown here the proceedings of this assembly at IUGG level, and a picture by Walter Lambert and Pierre Tardy. Now, in 1951, in the assembly in Brussels, General Assembly, there has been first election of a new president, Swiss, Bechlin, but also new bylaws has been adopted for the IUGG, and a new organization was also decided at that time, which was written in the bylaws, by the creation of section within IUGG, and so there was created 5 sections: triangulation, leveling, geodetic astronomy, gravity and geoid. And there was also a created commission, they could term at that time, but which in fact were this is a picture of Bechlin, but in fact in 1954 in Rome, where again a new president was elected, James de Grafenfeld, the structure of IUGG has been modified. So the section were kept, but the commission, which was more or less the continuation of the old commission, was completely modified by a new structure where they created study groups or special study groups, which is what we know still now, and which were defined more or less as now as group, temporary group on specific issue, and which were usually under the supervision of a section, and remained the commission, but which were really called for permanent commission, and which were dealing with a more permanent type of activity, and several of them we known because they are still very long. You had the International Gravity Commission, which was created at that time, European Triangulation, or which remains up to more recently, European leveling, a geodetic bibliography, which became a commission at that time, and there was a last commission which was created, but in fact, taking back the activity of a previous commission, was called International World Longitude Genetic Commission, in order to make this homogeneous system of longitude. So, this is a picture of the new president who was elected at that time. And so, this is the main point concerning the evolution of the organization of IUGG I wanted to mention for that period. I have just here for remembering all the list of all the General Assembly who was created. So we mentioned many of them, but some of them where there has been the usual work was not, I didn't mention. And also I made here a summary of all the President of General Secretary for this period. So you had Raoul Gauthier mentioned, William Bowie, Henning Meinens, Lambert, Bachelin, and De Graaf-Winter, and the last one who, for that period was, as president, was Gino Cassinis, and the two general secretaries I mentioned already. So I just show a picture of the last president of that period to be complete. Now, just to finish the review of this organization, I wanted to give a few words about the international service, because you see, this is a type of activity which is now very important within the present organization. So I have just summarized here the birth of the various organizations we could label as international service. First, it was the International Latitude Service, which is old because it was created in the first part in the old, if I would say, IUGG in, if I remember, 1899. This was the ILS. The ILS activity was continued, in particular the provisional IUGG during the World War I had one of the tasks to try to continue that this station would work. So there has been a continuity of the data collection, and this is why in 1922 this was one of the gifts for the transmission to the new organization of the work of the ILS, and the new director, Kimura, was elected, and this was located in Mississauga, where in fact this service remained, changed the name later, but in PMS, but it remained on that place. On the other hand, a new bureau was created, which is the BIH, Bureau International de l'Heure. In fact, the decision to have this bureau was done in 1912, but due to the war, in fact, a formal creation was done only after the war, so in 1919, and within the Paris Observatory. So this is a new bureau which was created at that time, with in particular the role to this coordination of the network of longitude around the world, astronomical longitude. Another bureau which was started just before was the Isostatic Institute in Helsinki, which was so continued during that time. And two other bureaus were created also more recently during that period. First, the International Gravity Bureau, the BGI, was created in 1951 in France. It was Père Leger, who was the first director of this bureau, and in fact he was even hosted by the IUGG Central Bureau at the beginning in the same place that this Central Bureau. And finally, more recently, you related to that period, in fact, after the International Geophysical Year, in 1958, was created in Brussels the International Earth-Light Center with Paul Melchior, the former IUGG General Secretary, many of you may have known, who was the first director of this. Okay. So this is basically the few points I wanted to mention you. As you see, it was really devoted to the organization of IUGG, so it's certainly not the abstract of the history of geodesy itself, but it may be useful, and I shall try to write it in more detail and publish it for those who may be interested, in particular, to give the source of all the reports, the General Assembly. I did a lot of work to read all the old books, and so to make the proper reference for people who may be interested. It is very often also, sometimes, if you are interested, to read some of the review of some of the session, to see that sometimes nothing is new under the sun. So, as I said, I did a really wide but short overview of the evolution of the international organization. Also, I mentioned the officers who were very formal, I mean, President General Secretary, but of course, many other, most of the geodesists has, of course, contributed to IUGG. I guess that in particular I shall try to also make a history of the study group to give you a more detailed history of what happened during that period. Another point I just wanted to summarize the importance of the development of the international services. We become, and which is interesting to see, because also you see that later it is expanded, and there is but it's interesting to see the birth and the way they were decided and organized. Concerning at least activity, but it is fully biased, but if you look into report, you see that during that period, there was at least 3 activity which was corresponding to the most of the geodetic activity, was really the expansion of the triangulation work, the junction, the international connection, the start of readjustment globally from all the terrestrial triangulation, also leveling, but at that time there was a huge set of material to be done. Also, a lot of recommendation for collection and deployment of gravimetry in land and sea, and also submarine gravimetry. If you read the resolution of Rome, if I remember, there was resolution to the marine of land to make measurement in submarine and so on. So many of the resolution was really focused on specific country and so on. And the third point which was a big effort on unification of longitude, because also the time that you had the time signal which will be started and so on. So you had new technology, which was at the birth of the VIH and also later of the transmission of UTC and so on, which little by little were unified, because you must remember that the reference frame at that time was purely astronomical, and so this was the basis frame on which the triangulation were allowed. And last comment I shall do is that still at the beginning you see that many people who are attending the General Assembly were very often considered as delegates, some more or less formally with foreign affairs, but there was the intent that the science and the international scientific cooperation was developing, and the fact you had two wars during that period where you had some conflict about country being there or not. So you see that it's more a sociological study which may be interesting, the evolution towards a real scientific non-governmental organization, while at the birth, because at the beginning it was really some type of intergovernmental organization. It moved during all that period into this time, which permitted a lot of people, for instance, during the various periods, still to meet together for discussing science like that, and so this is really thanks to IUGG and IUGG and their evolution. So I guess it's like more or less in time on what I was just wanted to show you. And so now it's time to see technological revolution coming from space with the third presentation today. Thank you for your attention.